credit to you. Last week or 2 weeks ago now, I have no idea when. It would have been 2 weeks ago when the Carson Wentz trade happened, about a week and a half ago. I listened to it this morning. You said, is Matt Ryan tradable? When you were thinking about the Colts options, and it made total sense from a lot of different levels. They needed a stopgap option. He was arguably the best immediate fit on the board in terms of what you could get out of him in 2022. What year is it? It's 2022. What you could get out of him in 20. It's been a week, man. What you could get out of him in 2022, what you'd have to give up to get him. It's $24 million. When you put the base salary and the roster bonus together, the roster bonus that they push back that ultimately was due today. So on a lot of different levels, like that's a fit there. Even if it's a short-term fit, that is a fit there. And that's ultimately what ends up happening.
Yeah. No, we'll see if they do Toronto Armstead, which would be my other dream move for them. But
I think that's a fantasy that's not going to come true, my friend.
Sky. Yeah. The other one was what? Like an Oreo in the sky. That Toronto Armstead there is a pie in the sky. Yeah. It just makes total sense. I mean, it's a lack of imagination seeing what they've been going through. They did the Rivers stuff. And I was like, they obviously want a vet. They have no first round pick. It's a wide open division. What the hell could they do with it? So I'm kind of like, it made a ton of sense. I'm kind of happy that it came out came out this way. And I'm excited to see it. I'm really excited to see number 2 back there for the playing quarterback there, a different number 2 than maybe before.
2 is available.
2 is available. It became available very soon, or very recently. I like the fit, just even on the offensive stuff, like with Matt Ryan there, being able to operate from under center more of a traditional attack. That's going to unlock so much, even with Jonathan Taylor, who was the best running back in football last year. Now he gets unlocked even more. And I just like that. I really do. And I know that's running the ball, but just as far of a stylistic fit, it makes sense because Matt likes being under center as well. So I just, there's a lot to this trade that I like. I can get into some Jonathan Taylor stats. I've juiced up for this, but I want to hear what you want to say about it too.
So let's talk about just the overall musical chairs aspect of this. So when you think about where the Colts were coming into this offseason, they were hell-bent on getting rid of Carson Wentz. They did that. They got 2 third-round picks, and Carson Wentz will cost them nothing on the cap this year. They got $28 million of Carson Wentz off the books. That was a mess of their own making. Yeah. They don't deserve a ton of credit for recouping value from Carson Wentz. They gave up their first round pick this year and a pick last year to go get Carson Wentz. When you look at the trade compensation they gave up in the Wentz deal and they got back, ultimately they traded like the 18th or 19th pick in the 2022 draft for Carson Wentz. That's a lot. It's a lot to give up. But when that's done, we're living in that world. How do you try to fix it? I think this outcome is pretty darn good when you consider the alternatives. Okay. They swap Wentz for 2 third-round picks. So in the end of this, the Colts ultimately traded Carson Wentz for Matt Ryan, $5 million in 2022 cap space, and a conditional third-round pick in 2023. You do that deal 100 times out of 100, don't you?
Absolutely. It makes sense. It's such an upgrade. I mean, it's yes.
An upgrade on a football level? What about the other stuff?
Yeah. Just the headaches.
Having Matt Ryan in the building where you are as a franchise, it's the same arguments for going to get Phillip Rivers a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And I made a joke about this on Twitter today, that it feels inevitable that they're going to do this. They're going to be pretty good. Matt Ryan's going to be pretty good. We like Frank Reich as an offensive coach. They have a couple pieces. It's a good infrastructure. The organization's been really solid on offense over the last 3 or 4 years. They're going to win 10-ish games, maybe win the division, give somebody a little bit of a scare in the wild card round, maybe lose. Like, oh man, the Colts, they got a good thing going over there, the Colts. And then after the season, Matt Ryan's like, you know what? I'm 37. It's been a good run. I've made $300 million playing football. I appreciate you guys. I'm out of here. And then we're going to have the same conversation again.
I hope not.
It's not even a stretch that could happen. But what are you going to do if you're the Colts?
Yeah.
Are you take a step back? You're going to go take a swing for a younger quarterback? This seemed like of all the alternatives, one that made sense, even if that possibility and having to do this again might be on the horizon in a year. I totally understand wanting to go this direction.
It's
not a lot to do it.
It's such a weird thing. It's almost like Matt Ryan blended what they did the last 2 years of Wentz and Phillip Rivers. They got the vet, but they're going to compete in the division. I don't know. It's like a weird blending of ideas. They like kind of like honed in. They're like, okay, I guarantee you once it's all said and done, they're like, okay, I'm tired of all these vets. I'm going to draft. I'm telling you, it reminds me of the late 90s Vikings so much, going Warren Moon to Brad Johnson to frickin' Randall Cunningham to Jeff George. And finally, these are all 1 year guys. And they finally were just like, okay, draft Dante Culpepper. Like we got to get our guy of the future. And it feels like that's what's going to end the end game for all this with the Colts, whether it's next year or 2 years from now, or whether they grow a guy with Matt going into his second year. Who knows? But this is the new door that they're going down, the new path that they're going down. And Matt Ryan's still, I think, an above average to good quarterback. He
had some good moments last year in a really shitty situation.
Yes.
He had some good moments in a rough situation last year. That offensive line was nightmarish.
Atrocious.
He had very few receiving options on the outside of Kyle Pitts. Remember that game he had against the Bucs where we were freaking out about how well he played? If you put him in a better situation, I totally understand being able to talk yourself into a better version of Matt Ryan.
Yes.
So the ideal outcome here for the Colts, in my opinion, okay, what is left on his deal, which by all accounts they are not touching, is essentially 2 years and $50 million. Mm-hmm. More than palatable for a short-term starter. Essentially what Brady got from the Bucs, which is hilarious, by the way. This is what Brady got for the Bucs as Matt Stafford gets his $40 million a year extension. The Bucs getting Brady for that is insane. Okay. So if that's the deal, if it's a 2 year, $50 million deal, he'll be 37 in net. Ideally, you get him for 2 years, right? You get him for this year and next year at that price. That does not preclude you at all from making a play for your quarterback next year.
Correct.
When you have that extra second round pick potentially from Washington. You've got some ammunition. Can we go get a guy and say, all right, we don't have to play him right away. We have Matt Ryan in 2023. This now becomes our long-term plan. I think if that's how it ultimately fell for Indianapolis, that would be the best case scenario.
I agree. And I it's basically doing with Matt Ryan what we wanted the Falcons to do with a quarterback last year. I mean, basically, that's kind of the same situation. And
I want to talk through that because I think it's easy to say that about Atlanta, but I think there are a lot of things to take into account when you're making that calculation. I do want to talk about that. I think it's easy to say, well, man, they should have taken that quarterback last year. But I think there's a lot to take into account as we have that conversation. Before we do that, I want to talk about just where the Colts sit now. Okay. So obviously in the division with Matt Ryan, they might be the best team in the division, even with Matt Ryan. I mean, the Titans are still a good team that they've made some moves. We can get to those a little bit later in the show, whether it's Robert Woods or going to get Austin Hooper. I mean, I think the Titans are still a solid team, but with Matt Ryan, this Colts team is pretty intriguing. They still have needs though. They still need a left tackle and we'll see how that ultimately gets filled. It feels almost inevitable that they just bring Eric Fisher back on like an $8 million a year deal. What they're doing is they're waiting out the value. Like that's what they're doing. They're going to sit there. Chris Ballard has the resting heart rate of like a 95-year-old tortoise, both good and bad. It serves him at times. And I think that it's often bites him at times. And in these moments, it has served him. If they can go get a starting left tackle on the cheap, whether it's Dwayne Brown or bring back Fisher, even though he wasn't very good last year, they're going to try to find value there. Even the Matt Ryan thing is value. They gave up less for Carson Wentz or for Matt Ryan than Washington paid for Carson Wentz. And that's a product of this team just sitting there being like, I'm not going to overpay for anybody. The Carson Wentz trade from last year, that's the outlier how this team does business. This stretch of moves is back to what we expect from them. Again, both good and bad. There are benefits to it, but there are also drawbacks to it.
Absolutely. And that's what's so funny about him is that I love how you compared him to a 97-year-old tortoise.
That's what it is.
It was like last year they had a little coffee and they're like, oh, they jolted awake and decided just, they did a move. And
I think Frank got a little overexcited.
I think so too. He was like, we're a step away. Let's get our guy. Yeah. The hair went out there. I love the stylistic fit. I think you nailed on the head. They still need the tackle. Of course, they're going to have other O-line movement that they'll need. I think receiver wise, they need a speed guy, need a number one. Like they still need to add something there.
Will Fuller for $7 million. I'm telling you, they're just sitting here waiting.
And
they're the guy at the end of the fantasy draft that has like all his money left over and hasn't gotten any players and can just pick off guys for whatever he wants. That's what they can be right now if they want to.
4 roster spots left and he has $44. And
that's what it feels like.
Yeah,
that's what it feels like. Other teams are trying to get Will Fuller for $1 and they're like, all right, I'll give him 4.
Yeah.
I mean, it's whatever.
and it's when the auction just ends right away. Like, that's it. Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like. MVS would be too rich for my blood. They also,
that's not going to out of that guy.
But also the second and third rounds, there's great potential there. There's I can't reiterate enough. There's tons of receiver talent in this draft. Like, and we'll talk about the Jags in a sec about that. I also just want to talk about the stylistic fit. I already hinted.
Yeah. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, and Jonathan Taylor, even this happened at Wisconsin, he's better from under center. He's a traditional old school back. Wisconsin even went to the pistol more so he can stay like almost I formation more. That's what the pistol does. It lets running backs be downhill on the run game as opposed to side, which yell at the Chiefs for doing all the time with their running backs, but that's a story for another time. But with Jonathan Taylor last year, under center rushes, 5.7 yards per under center rush. That's second in the NFL behind Rashad Penny. He also had like 200 more carries than Rashad Penny from under center. 23 total EPA. That was easily number one. 46% success rate. And this is all from True Media. Shotgun rushes, 5 yards per rush. So almost a 0.7 yards different. I know that's a basic stat. Only 2.48 total EPA from shotgun rushes and 43% success rate. He's just a better running back from those under center looks. Matt Ryan is extremely comfortable being under center. Also, this is kind of like the flip side of it. Now Frank Reich is going to have to do all those RPOs that he wanted to do with Carson Wentz, because that's what Carson Wentz likes to do. That's like there's the game, I want to say it was against the Bucs as well, which we talked about before. There's the famous clip by Quentin Nelson said like, hey, enough with the RPOs, just get the ball to 28, get him going. Yeah. That was because they called the RPOs and sometimes they handed it off, but sometimes Carson Wentz, because that's what the read was giving them, was throwing the little stick routes. And all of a sudden the Bucs dropped into it and they covered it like twice in a row. Now, if you're becoming just a traditional run, traditional play action, traditional drop back, just traditional offense, sprinkle in the RPOs once in a while, but now you don't have to major in them. It just unlocks your best asset, which is Jonathan Taylor. I think the blending of styles makes a lot of sense as well. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. And I think also is that with Ryan Kelly at center, Quentin Nelson, we got those top two guys. Of course, they're going to have to figure out the tackle situation, but having those guys is Matt Ryan's gotten used to playing behind some shitty offensive lines.
100%. And you got Braden Smith at right tackle. It's the makings of a solid line. They need a stopgap starter at left tackle, but most outcomes, the offensive line is a plus for this team.
It's one of the better lines he's ever worked behind. And He has a center this is probably the center he's going to trust the most since he's played behind Alex Mack. Yeah. Now that's going to actually help all of them as far as mentally. Protection wise, they're going to be great because they have two guys that can really handle it. So I think that's going to have a boon. Even just maybe it's like, oh, it's not whatever they do at left tackle, but I think as a whole, the whole unit will be a step better when they do the drop back stuff, just because mentally they'll be so much sharper.
I have a contractual obligation to mention that Zach Pascal signed with the Eagles, so he's out of the equation here, which is sad. RIP to our Zach Pascal Colts love. It was really, really enjoyable.
Someone on Twitter said, I'm an Eagles fan. Is this guy a good run blocker? Because I know we're going to have to need him. And I was like, boy, is he. I cracked my knuckles, sent him like 3 clips. And I was like, I don't even know who this guy is. But I was like, oh, no, I have plenty of Zach Pascal blocking clips to show you.
I am so interested in what the conversation between Frank Reich and Matt Ryan is going to look like here, because this is a conversation he's had to have every single spring for the last 4 or 5 years, right?
Yep.
And that process of having to retailor your offense to your quarterback every single year is really hard.
It's exhausting.
And the fact that they've maintained some semblance of offensive success, when I'm talking about why I like Frank Reich as a coach and why I think he's a pretty good one, the fact that they've been a borderline top 10 offense every year with all these guys outside of the Jacoby Brissett year, it's really hard to do that.
Yeah.
So and at least with Carson Wentz, he has a ton of familiarity. Press Taylor, who was there with them last year and now is in Jacksonville, had a ton of familiarity with Carson Wentz. There's background, there's history. Now they're starting over again. And I have faith that they can make it work, but that's going to be a process. That's going to be a dialogue that probably starts today. It is going to be nonstop, and it's going to need to be, because if they're going to get this thing up to speed, hopefully by early in the season, you've watched them over the last few years. It's taken time every year. Think about the first 4 or 5 weeks of the Rivers experience. It wasn't great, and they ultimately were a top 10 sort of unit. They were dead in the water last year and looked pretty darn good in the middle stretch of the season after everyone got comfortable. So are we in for another slow start? What does that ultimately look like? These are the questions worth asking. But when you're a team like the Colts that is halfway toward being a contender, this is the only direction you can push it.
Yeah.
You can't bring it all the way back to the start. And I think this is a right middle ground.